This episode of Food Psych is brought to you by my book, Anti-Diet, Reclaim Your Time, Money, Well-Being, and Happiness Through Intuitive Eating, which is out in paperback in North America this week. You can also get it as a hardcover, audiobook, and ebook wherever you get your books. Just go to christyharrison.com/book to order it now. Welcome to Food Psych, a podcast about intuitive eating, health at every size, body liberation, and taking down diet culture. I'm your host, Christy Harrison, and I'm an anti-diet registered dietitian, certified intuitive eating counselor, and author of Anti-Diet, which is available now, and a forthcoming book tentatively titled Rethinking Wellness, which will be out in early 2023. Join me here every week where I answer listener questions about how to break free from diet culture and interview inspiring people about their relationships with food, roads to body acceptance, and revolutionary ideas about what health really means. And by the way, on this show, we bleep out diet culture stuff like weight and calorie numbers, but we don't censor swear words or other adult language, so listener discretion is advised.
Anti-diet revolution, we're for health at every size. Eat the foods you like. Food Psych.
Hey there, welcome to this special bonus episode of Food Psych. I'm your host, Christy Harrison, and today I'm briefly back from hiatus to share a rare recording from the hardcover book tour of Anti-Diet to celebrate the book's release in paperback tomorrow. At the event you're about to hear, fellow anti-diet dietitian Heather Caplan interviewed me before a live audience about how to fight the co-opting of the anti-diet movement, language to use when talking to people who are brand new to this approach, how to spread the anti-diet message in healthcare, schools, the social sciences, and your own life, how I got away with writing a book called Anti-Diet in a culture that's very much pro-diet, and lots more. This episode was recorded in February of 2020, just before the start of the pandemic, and it's still all too relevant for 2022. As you probably know, the podcast has been on hiatus while I write my next book, which is tentatively titled Rethinking Wellness, though it looks like that's probably going to change to a title that I like even better. And it'll be published by Little Brown & Company's Spark imprint in early 2023. And if you're hearing about this the day it comes out, I'll actually be turning in the manuscript for that book in about 4 days, which is bananas, but I've had the most amazing time writing it, and I'm really excited for you to be able to read it eventually. But I'm not quite ready to come back from our podcast hiatus yet, because right now I'm about 8.5 months pregnant and getting ready to take several months of parental leave. So we won't be back to a regular podcasting schedule until sometime in April or May of 2022, but we'll continue to repost fan favorite episodes from the archives every week until then, including lots of great stuff to help you get through the new year and the January onslaught of diet culture, which I know is very real and increasingly very sneaky because diets are now posing as anti-diets, which can be extremely confusing for people who are newer to this work. That all being said, there are a couple of places where I'm still delivering new content very regularly, even during this podcast hiatus, and hopefully even during my maternity leave if I can get everything scheduled ahead. And that's one, in my Food Psych weekly newsletter, which you can sign up for at christyharrison.com/newsletter. And two, my Intuitive Eating Fundamentals course, which you can learn more about and join at christyharrison.com/course. And speaking of new content, I mentioned before that Anti-Diet is out in paperback in North America this week, actually tomorrow if you're listening to this the day it comes out. And the paperback has a few minor changes since the hardcover edition, so it might be worth checking out even if you already have the hardcover. And it makes a great belated holiday gift for anyone in your life who's interested in the anti-diet approach. You can grab a copy at christyharrison.com/book or at local bookstores all over. So now, without any further ado, let's go to my conversation with Heather Caplan, a fellow anti-diet dietitian and founder of Weight Inclusive Nutrition and Dietetics. She interviewed me in February of 2020 in front of a live audience at East City Bookshop in Washington, D.C.
Oh, yeah. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us tonight, spending part of your weekend with us. We're thrilled to have you here. We've just been kicking these off with a pretty obvious question to Christy. Why did this feel like the book you had to write, and why did this feel like the right time to write it?
Yeah, that's a great question. I love that as a kickoff, too, because it sort of sets the stage for all this. I should say before we start that we are recording this for the podcast. I finally got around to recording one of these book events to maybe air on a later episode. So when we open it up to the Q&As, just know that if you ask a question, your voice might be on the podcast. And, if you want to introduce yourself or whatever in order to hear yourself on the podcast later, then please feel free to do that. So the book, I think, came about from my own journey with this stuff, really. I started my career as a journalist in 2003, and I was obsessed with food because I was not eating enough of it, because I had developed an eating disorder in college and was restricting and binging, and, it made me obsess about food. And when I started as a journalist, you sort of look for a beat to call your own in journalism. And so I stumbled into food and nutrition as my beat because I was thinking about those things all the time, doing so much research on those things in my own life. And part of it, I think, too, was to try to master the thing that had such sway over me, how to be able to master my relationship with food and figure it out and, maybe unlock the secret. And when I first started writing about this stuff, I knew I wanted to write books. I've always wanted to write books since I was a child. And I worked in journalism and nutrition media for about 7 years. And then they closed the magazine I was working for, Gourmet, in 2009. And I decided that I wanted to go back to school to become a dietitian, get my master's of public health. And, at the time it was like, I'm going to help end the quote unquote obesity epidemic. That was the reason I went back to school, back into that program. And so it was really a long and winding path to come out of that mindset and to get around to an intuitive eating and health at every size approach. But one of the things that helped me do that was actually right after the magazine folded, I decided, okay, this is maybe a good time to pitch a book. Maybe this is the moment. And I had an agent who was really interested in working with me, and I was fresh off working at Gourmet, and people were sort of interested in what the Gourmet editors were going to go on to do. And so I pitched this idea that was a cultural history of emotional eating. Because I thought of myself as an emotional eater at the time still. I was still restricting food and therefore still feeling out of control, feeling emotional around it, and wanted to get to the bottom of what that was about. And also, how did our culture get this idea of emotional eating in the first place? Because my sense was this isn't something that's just existed since time immemorial. This is a particular cultural moment, or this came about from a particular cultural moment. And so I started researching that history of emotional eating and stumbled into the book Intuitive Eating by Evelyn Tribole and Elise Resch. And I also stumbled into some really interesting research showing that dieting and restriction predicts binge and emotional eating, that people don't really tend to, quote unquote, eat emotionally or eat their feelings without restriction being a part of the equation in some way. And so all of this science was blowing my mind, but I wasn't quite ready for it at the time. So I never actually finished that book proposal. I never turned it into a book, but all that research became the basis of what I ended up doing with the podcast, because I decided I wanted to explore more of that information in the podcast. And so when I started the podcast in 2013, it was about talking to people about their relationships with food, about their disordered eating habits, weird stories about food. We all are kind of weird about food. That was my working hypothesis. And as I went on, it got more and more specialized, because I started to specialize in disordered eating in my career as well. And I started to get hip to the ideas of health at every size and intuitive eating and bring those into my practice. And so the podcast became more and more specialized and more focused on those things, and became this great resource for workshopping these ideas, talking through ideas, talking to sources. Basically, as a journalist, you have to, for a book like this, you have to interview so many people. I was doing that over, the 5 years before I even pitched this book. So I was amassing all this data and all this information. And so by the time it came around to actually writing the book, I feel like I had a lot of the information already at my fingertips, because I had been gathering it for such a long time. But this book really wouldn't have come about if I hadn't tried to write that previous book 10 years ago, and also an intervening book I was going to do an eating disorder memoir, which I'm really glad I didn't do that, because the world does not need another eating disorder memoir from a thin white cisgender woman. But I had put together the full proposal for that and was able to mine that proposal to use for this and just like plug in the new ideas. So yeah, that's kind of how it all came about.
Yeah, but I also would love to hear how the process came about of calling or publishing the book as anti-diet, because I think like when I first saw the initial cover or, like media images come out, I was like, how did she get away with that? Because I feel like what we see so much in bookstores and media and pretty much everywhere is that the diet message sells. So I'd love to like get a little insight into the process of, we came up with the title anti-diet and we knew like it could still work.
Yeah, it's so interesting, this process, because like I think it's a lot messier than people might imagine. So initially I pitched the book to my agent as the life thief, because if you've read the book or listened to the podcast and stuff, that's kind of an organizing metaphor in my work. The diet culture steals your life. It steals your time, your money, your well-being, your happiness, your energy, your mental space. And so I had pitched it as the life thief. My agent thought it was kind of too negative. She's like, negative titles don't really sell. It also might be a little vague for what this is about. So we brainstormed and we came up with enough. And it was like enough, how diet culture steals your time, blah, blah, blah. And that's where we sold it to Little Brown Spark, who's my publisher. And they were like, yeah, that's still a little vague for a title. We need a title that really stands on its own, that doesn't need the subtitle to describe it, where it can like just say what it wants to say when someone, on the media says the title. And so we were brainstorming all these different ideas and nothing was quite sticking. And my agent, this was like back and forth for like a couple weeks, just like all these ideas. I'm like, nah, not quite right. Nothing quite right. So my agent went through my website and she was like, just kind of wanted to get some inspiration. So I was looking at your website and I noticed you describe yourself as an anti-diet dietitian. Like, what about anti-diet? And I was like, yeah, amazing. So easy. And like, I never would have thought to pitch that because I didn't know, when I first started working with them, I wasn't sure because they've published so many other diet books. Right. And I was like, they seem to get it. Like in our initial meeting, they really, really got it. And like the feminist angle, the social justice angle, like it was all there. And I felt so excited and like was very looking forward to working with them. But I was also like, in practice, I don't know how this is going to be. I don't know if they're going to push back on some of my more radical ideas. So when we came up with the title, it was like, damn, yes, like this is really, they're walking the walk. And like really did like the whole way through.
Someday we'll live in a world where these aren't radical ideas. Eventually. You've talked about how the podcast has evolved and how initially it was conversations with people being weird about food. And you've also talked about how your first conversation with Isabel Fox and Duke really shifted the tone and your perspective on things and kind of how you took the podcast from there. So I'd love to hear some insight into that conversation and what really resonated with you.
Yeah, that conversation was so interesting because my friend Katie Dale-Bout had come on the podcast in our second season, like very early in the second season, to talk about orthorexia. And I didn't know her then, really. We became friends after that. But she like came to my house and she was just this sweet, like scared 22-year-old recovering from orthorexia. And I very much like took to her. And she was like, you need to talk to my friend Isabel. She talks about a lot of the same things, and I had been working in eating disorders and learning about health at every size and was starting to bring that into the podcast a little bit. She's like, oh, Isabel talks about that stuff a lot, and like connected me with her. And the conversation Isabel and I had was just so inspiring to me and so much fun and just made me realize that like at the time I was seeing HAES talked about in these very academic ways, at conferences by people with all these letters after their name, by people 20, 30 years my senior in a particular sort of way. And Isabel was talking about it in a very radically different way. She was like swearing and using, like millennial language to talk about HAES basically. And I was like, oh, there's a need for this. There's a need for like to bring HAES in out of academia and out of this sort of ivory tower of people who work with eating disorders into the community, into just like, using general language to talk about this stuff. And we talked about the restrict binge cycle and how emotional eating and binging are driven by restriction and dieting and deprivation, which was like, again, that research that I had discovered in researching that emotional eating book that never happened, was all just kind of living in my brain and percolating around there. And I was like, oh, here's someone else who's interested in that. And then when I shared that episode, people really resonated with that. People were loving that particular discussion around like binging or restriction driving binging and emotional eating. So I think that's where, the people's response to that episode, and also just like how I felt when having that conversation, just like alive and inspired and excited. And like I had, met an old friend, even though I had just met her, was part of what, changed the direction of the podcast. And I was like, who else is like Isabel? Who else is doing this work? That's how I discovered Virgie Tovar. That's how I discovered Melissa Fabello. Like, a lot of the people that I had on that early, second or third season of the podcast when it kind of changed directions.
So we know that diet culture shifts shapes. You guys know what I mean? All the time. And that we've seen some of the same old things come back over and over again. I'm wondering, based on the research that you did for this book and maybe for the previous book as well, what might we anticipate from diet culture in the next couple of years? Like, where do we see some things coming back, some trends that are just never going to go away? What's on the radar?
Yeah, I think like the low carb trend is never going to go, well, not never, because it was away for a long time. Like it actually started in the 1860s. And then it went away for a long time in the 1900s up until the like 1990s, and then it came back, and now it's here again, and it sort of underpins all the different diets that we see today in some way, shape, or form. So I think that that's probably going to be around for a while longer, because I think a lot of diets are spinning off of that still and getting traction for doing that. I think that we were talking about this last night too, like the co-opting of the anti-diet movement is going to be huge. Like we're already seeing that this year. I feel like we're in a bookstore that may have this book, but there's another book that has a title somewhat similar to mine that people have like confused mine for. And it's a very, very different message. It's like, that book is a diet, even though it says it's not a diet. And this is actually anti-diet. And I think there's a lot of things sort of masquerading as it's not a diet, it's a lifestyle, it's a plan, it's a program, it's a protocol, it's a template, what have you. And it actually is still a diet. And, diet culture is the system of beliefs that underlies anything that, calls itself, whatever it calls itself, it still shares the same fat phobic and food phobic system of beliefs. And so I think we have to get very good at just drilling down to the basics and these like basic principles that all diets, plans, programs, protocols, lifestyles, blah, blah, blah share, and recognize those things no matter what the external trappings are, no matter what, is it like carbs are vilified, or is it grains or dairy, or are you cutting out foods? Are you only eating certain times of the day? Are you intermittently doing certain things, whatever, there's all these different ways that it can look on the surface and that it can seem really different on the surface. But when you go down to like, what is it actually about? Is it about demonizing some foods and elevating others? Is it about, elevating smaller bodies over larger ones and stigmatizing larger bodies? Is it, are these things maybe subtle, but there's still this oppression that's happening? If so, it's still part of diet culture and it still needs to be called out, and it's still harmful. So,
yeah. The book in question isn't really hiding it. At the top of the book, it says your permanent solution to weight loss. So that would be clue number one.
That's a big clue.
So as we think about diet culture and co-opting this message of the anti-diet movement, what are some really effective ways to kind of call that out? So maybe just in conversation with a friend, someone who's like, I'm trying Noom. And you're like, what do I say to that? What's an effective, compassionate way to approach those conversations?
Yeah, it's such a good question. I think it depends on like how well you know the person, where the person is in their journey. They're probably excited. They're probably in that honeymoon phase of the diet where it's like going well and they want to shout it from the rooftops. And so I think that's a tough place to like rain on somebody's parade. It's tough to get that message, get your point across when someone's in that place. But I think you can set boundaries. I think you can say like, especially if you're closer to someone, say like, I love you. I want to talk about everything in your life with you, but this is one area that just really, is problematic for me. It's really harmful for me to hear about your diet because I'm healing my relationship with food. I've struggled in my own life with this stuff. And so, can we please make this, like, take this off the table? I think if people are struggling in their new lifestyle in any way, that's a place where you can sort of plant a seed, maybe get in there a little bit and say, yeah, actually, research shows that really diets don't work for the vast majority of people long term, and that maybe you have this like honeymoon phase at the beginning where it seems to work. But if you're binging or if you're finding yourself having a hard time sticking to this diet, it's actually not your fault. This is what the science says happens. So giving people some kind of solidarity with that and some compassion for what they're struggling with. Depending on the context too, I think bringing up like weight stigma and weight cycling can be helpful. That's kind of more with people who are like trying to say it's about health, or maybe with health professionals who are pushing it on you, or saying that they've, because I feel like a lot of doctors, this is not news, but doctors don't really get education in nutrition. Like they maybe have a semester, if that, sometimes it's just a few weeks within one course on nutrition. And so they're not really trained in a lot of, nutritional ideas. They're sort of taking what works for them or what they've heard work for some patients, quote unquote worked, and then passing that along. So sometimes they might be like, well, keto worked for me, or Weight Watchers, or I've always just done this, and that's what, keeps my weight down, or whatever. And so if you hear something like that at the doctor's office, I think bringing up weight stigma and weight cycling and the science around those can be really helpful, even if you don't have a ton of time in that encounter, just to plant a seed for someone. Like weight cycling and weight stigma are independent risk factors to health. They are, no matter what a person's body size is, the more weight stigma they experience, the more they weight cycle in their life, the worse their health outcomes are going to be. And those things raise people's risk of things like heart disease, diabetes, some forms of cancer, mortality, all things that get blamed on body size itself that can actually better be explained by weight stigma and weight cycling. There's even research showing that weight stigma is a bigger risk to people's health than what they eat, which is like, for me as a dietitian, when I read that, I was like, okay, this is really incontrovertible evidence that as dietitians, at my field at least, we need to stop stigmatizing people under the guise of helping them eat better, and we have to, if we're going to deliver any sort of messages about nutrition, they have to be done in a very sensitive way without, shaming people and sort of pushing on those triggers that exist for most of us in diet culture anytime someone tells us we need to eat differently. So I think it depends on the context, but like there's these little ways you can do it. And also it's hard. Like there's no simple solution. There's no like, here's the one magic thing to say, it's different for everybody. And these conversations are sometimes messy, and sometimes people get mad and, hurt feelings and all the rest. So I think it's just tough. It's a case by case thing.
Yeah. Carrying on some of the threads that you mentioned in that answer, I'm curious if you were to pick maybe one or two themes within the book that could be implemented into healthcare education, whether that's for dietitians, physicians, nurses, public health students. What do you think would be the most effective place to start, or that might at least plant some seeds and get people to think about things a little differently?
Yeah, I think the weight stigma and weight cycling piece is huge. I feel like weight stigma especially is good for healthcare providers, because healthcare providers want to do no harm. Healthcare providers want to help people. We get into it for that reason. And so if we hear that something we're doing is doing harm and see the evidence of that, and there is now a huge amount of evidence of that, people who are scientifically minded can dig into that. I tried to put a ton of footnotes in the book that people can dig into for further research on weight stigma. I think that's a really effective way to go about it, because it's sort of bypassing the whole issue of what works, what doesn't, because diets are very ineffective, up to a 98% failure rate within 5 years. But people can quibble about those details. People can quibble about well, if it's working for someone for 2 years, are they getting more benefit out of that than, even if they're going to regain the weight? And it's no, weight cycling is bad no matter what, that they're not going to get more benefit out of it. But I think sometimes arguing those details with someone who's already in the weeds is tough. So I think weight stigma is taking us, focusing on weight stigma takes a step back from all of that and says, it doesn't matter whether or not it's effective. We're stigmatizing people by telling them they need to lose weight, by telling them that their weight is a risk factor and that it's wrong. And here's the evidence of that. And, in order to not do harm, no matter whether a diet is quote unquote working for someone or not, we need to stop stigmatizing and shaming them. I think the ineffectiveness of diets conversation is also a really important one to have. And I think that healthcare professionals need to learn that, that it's not just a person's quote unquote willpower failing, that people are not responsible for their body size the way that it's been made out to be. Actually, 70% or so of our body weight is determined by genetics, and that other 30% can be determined by environmental factors that do not include food or exercise, but that do include things like dieting history of food insecurity and poverty, and things that can shift our body's set range of weight. So I think we need to be really, healthcare providers need to be educated about that too. That the personal responsibility argument is so harmful. It is weight stigmatizing in and of itself. And that also is very flawed, that personal responsibility argument. It doesn't actually have basis in fact.
Yeah. As I was reading it, I found myself wishing like the history part of it was even like a glimpse of my education, just better understanding how some of these things developed, including the quote unquote obesity epidemic, including the way that we use BMI in healthcare, because they're just accepted as truth and no one questions it. But then when you peel back the layers and you see how these things evolved over decades, there's a little bit of like, wait, what?
Yeah.
Like, how did we get away with this? Or why is no one questioning it? Like, how did we get to a place in healthcare where we accept so many norms and we don't question them?
Yeah, I think the history is huge. And like the reason I focus so much on the history in this book, it was supposed to just be one chapter, and then it ended up becoming 2 chapters and 2 of the longest chapters in the book because I just could not stop myself. And there's so much more that I had to cut out of this book. But yeah, the history is so fascinating to me, I think, because when we learn it, it does really register like, oh, wow, this is not how health professionals always thought. This is not how the general public always thought. Like, this is a cultural artifact that was handed down to us by previous generations that we don't always think to question.
Right.
And that the medical community certainly does not think to question. And I think knowing it and situating it in this historical context can give us at least a sense of like, it wasn't always like this. And if I was born at a different time in history, maybe I wouldn't be struggling so much with this stuff, if you are struggling. And yeah, for healthcare providers, I think can give a sense of like, okay, we really need to do better because this is really messed up. Like the way, especially the rhetoric around the so-called obesity epidemic developed, being so tied up with the pharmaceutical industry and the weight loss industry, and that funding from those sources drove the perpetuation of this myth of the creation and perpetuation of this myth of the obesity epidemic. I think makes a certain segment of health professionals mad, at least the ones who care about like ethics in healthcare. So not everyone.
Apparently, yeah. So we heard a little anecdote after the event last night that we were at Eaton Workshop, which is in Metro Center, and you can kind of see through the windows that there's an event happening. And so we heard that some people sort of just walked in like after a run or something, and they were like, what is this? Who's talking? And potentially bought one of the books. We would have to fact check that, but we think they did. So for that person, as you were writing the book and you maybe thought about the person who stumbles upon it in a bookstore or walks past Eaton Workshop on a Friday night and joins our event, what was some of the language that you considered really important for connecting with that reader who is really new to all of these topics?
That's a good question. I think it was just laying out the case step by step really clearly, because the podcast, I kind of just assume that people are going to catch up. Like new people join the listenership every episode, and I don't like do a primer and sort of go back and say like, here's all the things you missed or define terms every episode. I'm just like, I trust people to catch up. And I have a few episodes that are sort of primers to like help them get started. And so I wanted to take that, like sort of like, what do I have in my getting started episodes of the podcast to like set the foundation and describe how I'm even going to talk about this stuff. Like, so I have a couple sections in the intro where I talk about like the language I'm going to use in this book. And I say, I'm not going to use the words overweight or obese unless they're in quotation marks because they're stigmatizing. And you'll hear more about that later. I'm not going to use terms, I'm not going to talk about calories. I'm not going to talk about exact weights and numbers and clothing sizes and things like that, because they trigger vulnerable people and they can give people sort of a how-to manual to use disordered behaviors. And I don't want to do that. I want this to be a refuge from that. And so those things aren't going to be included. And if you're reading along and you find yourself wondering like what someone's weight is that's telling a story or what their exact clothing size is, like recognize that impulse comes from diet culture, that there was a time not that long ago in history when none of us even had access to information about weight or clothing sizes. And that going back to that might be beneficial to having like less of that information accessible. I also wanted to kind of make clear the social justice orientation right from the start, so it was like, we're going to be talking about oppression here. We're going to be talking about how diet culture intersects with other systems of oppression. And, you might have some resistance coming up as you read this, because these conversations about social justice often do bring up a lot of resistance. And so, just kind of giving people a heads up, like this might go against a lot of what you have been taught and a lot of what you believe very deeply. And if you're reading along and you find yourself wanting to basically like hurl the book across the room, like recognize that and maybe try to keep going, maybe, push through that, because there's some valuable information here that I hope you'll take in. I also wanted to like convey that I had been there too. And I share kind of later in the book that, I myself was very resistant to HAES when I first heard about it, Health at Every Size. Like I learned about it 10 years ago when I was guest editing a package at Slate Magazine, where a friend of mine who was an editor there actually was a pro HAES person and like knew about HAES already and was really all about it. And they wanted me to take over that package because he like recused himself. He's like, I can't do this. It's a package on childhood, oh word. And, I just can't bring myself to be a part of it. So he tapped me to edit guest edit the package. And we discussed, he wrote a piece for it and like kind of basically pushing back on the whole premise of it. And so we argued a lot and debated over that piece that he wrote and the writing of it. And he actually recommended the book Health at Every Size to me. He recommended the Fat Studies Reader and Lessons from the Fatosphere. And so I bought those books, and then they were sitting on my shelf for a couple years because I just couldn't bring myself to read them. I just wasn't ready, and I had just invested all this money to go back to school to like change my career in this direction that was supposedly about ending quote unquote O word. And here was this person telling me that this didn't, that this was actually harmful, that what I was spending hundreds of thousands of dollars on ultimately was, oops, I wish I could do that over again. It was wrong. And so I had a lot of resistance at first. So I get it. Like I get why people are resistant to this stuff. I get being so invested in the status quo. And eventually I came to be sitting here talking about this book I wrote that's all about health at every size. So, it's a journey for all of us. And I think if people can be open-minded and just allow for the fact that maybe your opinion will change, maybe your views will change down the line, rather than digging in their heels and, fighting back against it and stuff.
If we can endure flu-like symptoms from certain protocols, I think we can endure the discomfort of the social justice aspects of this movement. So one more question before we'll turn it over to the audience and see what questions you guys have. We are in DC, so we're going to just insert one little question about politics. Just going to try. You mentioned in the book the history of food activism and how that got started in kind of the late 2008, 2009s, early 2010s with the likes of Michael Pollan and Marion Nestle, and what they were sort of trying to achieve with many fat-phobic undertones. So we won't go down that rabbit hole, but for the people who are reading this book, who maybe in this city have access to policy changers or lobbyists or work in that space themselves, what are some ways in which activism can play into the anti-diet world, and what does that look like?
Such a good question. I think there really is like a big role that people in those positions can play in terms of like removing weight stigmatizing language and rationales from policy and bringing in an understanding of weight neutrality, weight inclusiveness, health at every size. And, that access to all kinds of foods is a social justice issue, not because certain foods are better than others and healthier than others, and some foods are bad and we need to eradicate them from the food environment, but because, everybody just deserves equal access to all kinds of food, and especially culturally important foods. And, to have the foods that whatever community you're working with wants to eat available to them is a human right. And I think also, working to remove language that's public facing that educates people on food as good or bad, right? So I used to work in policy actually too. I was at the City Department of Health in New York for 3 years working on nutrition policy. And this was before my HAES awakening. So, it was the sort of turnaround, my own relationship with food happened around that time where I started to make peace with food for myself and discovered intuitive eating and all of that. But I wasn't there yet in terms of like how I related to program development and the populations we were serving and all that. So a lot of the rhetoric, a lot of the like foundations for what we were doing were couched in quote unquote anti-obesity language. And, you know, a lot of the grants we got, a lot of the grants that paid my salary actually came from anti-obesity grants from the CDC and stuff. So I think removing that kind of rhetoric and that kind of language from anything public facing might be the first step. It's harder maybe to remove it from the rationale that you have to write in a grant to like get a position funded, you know, because it's the CDC, one of the CDC priorities for chronic disease is quote unquote obesity. So you might have to like kind of hold your nose and write about that in your grant proposal. But if you can remove language like that from anything that the public sees, so that it's not like we're bringing these fruits and vegetables into this neighborhood to reduce quote unquote obesity, or because the processed foods that people have been eating here are so unhealthy, you know, like taking away these messages that are shaming and blaming certain foods and people for eating in a certain way, and putting stigma on certain kinds of bodies. And I think too, as I was saying last night to someone who was in a federal position and was asking about like what she could do from the inside to make change, I was like, literature reviews are sort of a magic key, I think, in policy positions, because everything functions on literature. It's all evidence-based, and, you know, all kinds of nutrition policy really and health policy rests on these literature reviews of like, what does the science actually say about this? And let's like use this to guide our policy positions. And there's like so many great literature reviews out there that could be written about weight stigma, weight cycling, disordered eating, the ways that diet culture talks about food and bodies and nutrition is really harmful to people's well-being. So I think like just finding creative ways in whatever position you're in to bring in science and rationale around weight stigma and weight cycling and all the harms of diet culture, and then paving the way through that for health at every size, and looking at the literature on that too, and seeing like, you know, working on health behaviors, no matter what a person's size is, actually has positive health outcomes. And, you know, not that everyone needs to be working on their health behaviors, and health is, you know, not an obligation or entirely within our control, as Reagan Chastain always says. But to the extent that people do have the capacity to work on their well-being, there are things that we can all do to support our health that have nothing to do with food or weight.
Yeah. All right. Well, we will turn the questions over to you guys. So who wants to get us started?
Don't be shy. Yes.
Hi, I'm Rebecca. I'm a huge fan of your podcast and read your book. It's amazing. So for people kind of piggybacking on your lobbying question, for people that don't work in the government and are not healthcare professionals but want to advocate for your book and for other books like it, and I don't know, get it into libraries, and like, because I looked online, the DC Library has one copy of this book, which was great that it has one copy, but like, how do we get more copies and into bookstores? Because I feel like people need to read the book, but if it's not accessible to them, then I don't know how you deal with that.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. So yeah, I think getting the book into more places is like one of my pet projects as well. I would love everyone's help in that. So I think just like asking at bookstores to, you know, see if they can stock it. I know most independent bookstores can order things for you and like, you know, ship it in just for you, but it's harder sometimes to get them to devote limited shelf space to something that they don't really know about. So, you know, if you can talk to someone at your local neighborhood bookstore who maybe you have a relationship with already, or, you know, find someone at the bookstore who seems like they might be open to this idea, you know, asking for like at least one copy to be stocked and see how it goes. With libraries too, I think like requesting it, you know, and if everyone, even if you're not planning to get it from the library, and if you already have it, but you request it from your local library and there's a big waiting list, that can inspire them to buy more copies. So yeah, I think, you know, what was the other question? Getting into like,
I think just getting the word out there when you're not a healthcare professional, and like, obviously I can share with my friends, but I think getting the message out there, especially like getting people to read the whole book is sometimes not always like the most possible thing right away. But again, I think it's just getting message out there when like I'm not like a social media influencer and I'm not, I don't have this community just to like readily share with, but I want the message to get out there because it's good for me and it's good for everybody. And so that's what happened.
Yeah, thanks. It is good for everybody. I think when this message gets out there too, because those of us who are working to be anti-diet in our lives can get support from our friends and family and the people around us. So I think too, like no matter what your job is, oftentimes workplaces will have like workplace wellness stuff, or if they don't, you could maybe start something under like the auspices of Hayes and intuitive eating and make it a totally different kind of workplace wellness initiative, and talk to the workplace wellness initiatives that you do have already existing about maybe removing some weight stigmatizing stuff if they have that. I know some workplaces have like horrible diets that they recommend and like fitness tracking and BMI requirements and all of that stuff. So, maybe sitting down with your HR manager, whoever does that, and asking them to, and sort of laying out the case for why this is weight stigmatizing and can be harmful to people and trigger eating disorders and what needs to be done instead. Thank you.
Yep.
Workplace book club.
Yes.
Yeah.
Melissa.
So kind of piggybacking on that question, as you mentioned earlier, there's a lot of weight stigma in the medical community. So, and I think the content that's in this book would be really helpful to physicians, nurses, nurse practitioners, and other people in that community. So what conversations have you had so far, and what are you planning to do in order to get this book in front of large swaths of healthcare professionals?
That's a great question. So far I've, spoken to different organizations, like Fancy, the dietitians organization, a couple of years ago when I was writing the book, but basically, all the main points in the book were in my talk there, and a Massachusetts dietitians organization after that. And, just like smaller groups of dietitian practices, therapy group practices, basically anyone who has any sort of like continuing education or like lunch and learn type of thing set up. I've been able to like sometimes pitch, or sometimes they come to me. Actually, a lot of the time they come to me and I have no idea that this organization or company is doing anything like that. So, not as much necessarily with healthcare providers, but like corporations have come to me and asked me to speak about this at their lunch and learns and stuff. So that's been really cool. But in terms of like doctors, I think it's sometimes really tough sell, because especially when doctors have been really steeped in diet culture and doing their thing for years or decades, it's like a tough thing to turn the ship around. So I think medical students are kind of the key there. And I want to start speaking to, this is one of my goals for like the coming year after I'm done book touring and stuff, is to start speaking to like medical students, organizations, and going to medical schools and sharing this information. Because I think that that's where we have some potential to make change. And I've already met a lot of medical students at these kinds of events that are like really excited about the content and trying to make change from within, or be a different kind of doctor once they do get their license. Yeah. Do you have any ideas to add? Yeah.
I would say also supporting the people who are doing research in this space, because they are up against a lot of challenges. They have a really hard time getting funding from the NIH and CDC, which is kind of like considered the gold standard in academia. So like it could be self-funded somehow if you can find the money, but really what's taken more seriously is something funded from NIH. So Kendra Sonneville and Dr. Jeffrey Hunger come to mind, obviously Tracy Tilka, Tracy Mann. I try to share those papers as often as I can, just to get more eyes on them, to get more people interested in that work, and so that people know that this literature is out there. Because I think a lot of, at least in my experiences, a lot of students and physicians who hear about this the first time are like, well, that's not based on any evidence. It's like, well, but we have some evidence, actually. So also your approach, let's talk about that being based on evidence. Anyways, I think just supporting the people who are working kind of behind the scenes without any, influence on social media, but are doing a lot of hard work to get this information out there.
And that actually makes me think too, like, for all of you, when you go to the doctor, when you go to any sort of specialist, like you could print out, Jeffrey Hunger actually has a great paper with colleagues of like, basically it's an update of Linda Bacon and Lucy Aframore's 2011 piece that sort of looks at all the harms of weight stigma, weight cycling, the conventional weight paradigm, but, is updated with lots more references and is basically like a review paper of like, here's all the evidence and sort of marshaling it. And it's published in a scientific journal. So like if you print that out and take it to the doctor, that could be an interesting place to start. Because I think a doctor is more likely to read a scientific paper, even though that one's pretty long for a scientific paper. I think it's like 30 pages, but maybe the bacon and Aframore piece is a little more digestible. But they're more likely to sit down and read a journal article than they are a 300-page book as their first approach to it. Maybe.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yes.
I've tried just about I was a fat kid, and I tried just about every diet you can think of. And I'm reading something about this book, or either saw something about it on morning news. And one of the concerns is that if we just try intuitive eating as opposed to dieting, we'll just like swallow up like a balloon. What would you say about such fears?
It's a great question. Thanks for asking. So a couple of things. I think the fear of swelling up like a balloon, like there's a lot of stigma in that, right? There's a lot of fat phobia in that. And, fearing weight gain is very much a product of diet culture and the system of beliefs that it's conditioned in us. And I think, if we can reduce the stigma and shame on being the size that our body wants to be, that'll go a long way toward alleviating that fear, which is a longer project, right? That's like the bigger cultural aim of this book is to help reduce weight stigma and dismantle the system of beliefs. But the other thing is that intuitive eating, people often think that intuitive eating is going to lead to continued weight gain forever and ever. And the reality is that our bodies do have a set weight range that they are genetically determined to be at. That, you might gain weight for a time after you've been dieting when you're letting go of the diets and the restriction and getting back to where your body really wants to be, but it will stabilize. It will find a place to stay, not that it'll be the same your entire life, because we all go through life phases and changes that can alter our weights, like, pregnancy, menopause, gender transition, whatever it might be. But you can trust that your body is not going to gain weight forever. And you can also trust that you're not going to eat forever the way that you might think you're going to, the out of control way you might feel that you're eating when you first start eating formerly forbidden foods. So, so many diets these days, right, have these lists of forbidden foods, and they're all somewhat similar. And as I was talking about, vilifying carbs is such a common thing. So oftentimes the forbidden foods are like sweets and sugar and carbs and, starchy snacks and processed food, quote unquote. And when you first stop dieting or start making an effort to eat intuitively, oftentimes you are gravitating towards those things that were formerly forbidden because the forbidden fruit tastes the sweetest. And because when we're deprived of something, the inevitable tendency is to swing over to the side of, wanting more of it and feeling abundant, trying to get abundance with it, trying to reassure yourself that you are going to have access to it again. And that is a natural swing of the pendulum, but that's not going to last forever either. So it's really true that you're not going to only eat brownies or whatever your favorite forbidden sweet is for the rest of your life, right? You might have a moment of that. You might have a few weeks of that, but eventually when you do have full unconditional permission to eat whatever you want, your sense of pleasure and your sense of taste and desire for variety is going to win out, so that you're going to be interested in other kinds of foods too. And we do see in the research that intuitive eaters have more variety in their menu actually than people who are dieting. And that is generally considered a positive nutritional indicator. So, people who are eating intuitively do not continue eating the formerly quote unquote junk foods or forbidden foods in a way that diet culture makes it out to be. It's just that you probably will have that swing initially and trust that it's a phase and trust that you can get through it to the other side, because diet culture is going to want to tell you, like, see, you're out of control when you eat cookies. What did I tell you? You need me, you need me, the diet, telling you what to do. So if you can just hang on through that and know that it's actually telling you a lie and that you really will be able to eat intuitively in a way that's supportive of well-being long-term. Yes.
Hi, I'm Liz.
Hi.
I just want to say thank you so much for your podcast. I discharged from recovery program about 2 months ago, and it's like a part of my daily recovery focused like regime that I put. Well, not regime, but
Practice.
yeah, practice. That's a better word for it. I just wanted to say some questions were asked about bringing this into the healthcare communities, bringing it as like someone who's not a part of that, and I'm wondering how we can bring this more into schools. Growing up, I didn't know that bodies were supposed to come in all different sizes. I didn't know that it was natural to gain weight, So I'm just wondering how we can bring this message more to that age group.
Yeah, that's so important. I think kids really need that message. And I didn't grow up with that message either. I feel like most of us didn't, we just grew up with a diet culture messaging. So I think, it's tricky in schools because obviously, you sort of have to have an in with the school. But I think if you have kids or you are a teacher or you have teacher friends that you can convince in this way to bring intuitive eating and HAES approaches into school, and also to bring anti-bullying and shaming, because I think bullying and stigma are a real focus now in schools, which is great, but they don't focus on body size necessarily. So bringing that in and sort of, I think kids are so smart, especially, even like the youngest kids are so smart in understanding how oppressions are connected and understanding injustice and understanding like, this isn't right. It isn't right to make fun of someone for something about their body that, they can't change, or even if it is something they could change, you shouldn't make fun of someone for the color of their shirt or whatever, So helping bring that sort of anti-weight stigma approach into the existing like anti-bullying framework, I think is really helpful. If you're a parent and you have any ability to like volunteer at the school, do PTA kind of stuff, you can bring it into maybe a PTA meeting or offer to volunteer in the classroom to teach a nutrition, unit, quote unquote, that's actually, because a lot of school systems actually now have requirements for wellness curricula. And those wellness curricula can be so weight stigmatizing and so food phobic, right? They can, make kids deathly afraid of sugar or, other foods that are deemed bad. And I've heard kids talk about like calories and how they've learned they're not supposed to eat too many calories. So they like avoid certain foods. And, if you can have some influence there of like being the person who volunteers to do that, or getting a local dietitian, Heather, for example, like to come in and do that work, and you can opt your kid out of those things too. So if your kid is in a program in a school that has, nutrition lecture or BMI report cards, they're being weighed at school and things like that, you can actually send a letter to the school and say, my child is not to participate in any of that stuff. And if that's happening at school while they're there, please pull them out and, send them to the library, or they can go to the nurse's office or wherever and like do some independent work and not be a part of that. I was just talking with a fellow health at every size practitioner, Rachel Milner, who's been on the podcast, who's coming back on soon. And she was saying that she's done that with some great success at her kids' school, actually. So I think there's ways that parents can be advocates, and of course, teachers. Like if, anyone here is a teacher and has the ability to make that kind of change, doing a unit on like talking, because I think a lot of times teachers these days are building in information about food and body size into their, math homework or like English or whatever it might be. They're bringing in basically weight stigma to those settings. So how cool would it be to bring in anti-diet stuff, anti-weight stigma into those moments and teach about the history of diet culture, or teach about how all foods fit and, the good things that food does for our bodies, and just help kind of neutralize all that stuff that's out there in schools. Because it's a minefield these days, for sure.
Do one more.
Thank you for your question.
So I'm going back to the research questions that happened a couple of minutes ago. So first of all, thank you so much for your work. It has been so enlightening, probably for everyone in this room and so many other people. So thank you. So within like the social science research world, there's kind of been some, like my field is anthropology. There's been some eating disorder anthropologists and like fat studies people, but it's still very hard to use the correct language to get grants for this research, especially when it's like you want to attack you want to have a working hypothesis where like anti-diet stuff will come up, or you want to use the social justice like lens. And I'm just basically asking, like, what questions do you feel need to be asked in these grant writing practices? Like, what do you recommend for social science research rather than the medical?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think you have more leeway in social science, actually, because, I think in the medical field, it has to be very like evidence-based and, this is what we know from the research and putting in a million footnotes and stuff. Whereas I think with social sciences, it can be more conceptual, and also refer to other social scientists who've come before and like expand on their work. And I think there's some, sociologists like Abigail Segui at UCLA wrote a book called What's Wrong with That? And has done a lot of research around like perceptions of weight stigma. She's got a number of studies with colleagues that are looking at how the framing of discourses around body size affect weight stigma and people who are subjected to that framing. So things like, a study of looking at giving people news reports that talk about the so-called obesity epidemic as like a public health scourge and a matter of personal responsibility actually increases weight stigma in the participants who are exposed to that stuff. So that could be a cool jumping off point to like, I think we need more of that kind of research that looks at like the nuances, because as I was saying earlier, like, anti-diet stuff is being so co-opted and Noom is literally calling itself the anti-diet. And it's like, God, what the hell is this? And it's like so particularly galling and hard to describe to someone who doesn't understand, right? To someone who isn't already versed in this stuff. So I think we need more research like that evidence by Segui and colleagues that looks at like, even the things you think are so innocuous, right? Even this book that calls itself an anti-diet book that talks about weight loss, even promoting weight loss in that subtle way actually increases people's levels of weight stigma. And if you can, some researchers, this is more, I think this is actually in the Department of Sociology. Do you know where Janet Tomiyama? I think it's sort of like an interdisciplinary department that she has at UCLA, but she's done research showing like exposing people to like subtle levels of weight stigma increases their cortisol levels. And I think partnered with, dietitian or someone to do that collection of data. So yeah, I think thinking creatively about these subtle ways that fat phobia shows up and operationalizing that in some way, making it clear, like with the data that, and Kendra Zonneville is another one who has a great like pilot study that she discussed on the podcast, has had a hard time getting NIH funding for the full study. But the pilot study shows that telling people their weight and then telling people that that weight is wrong also increases levels of weight stigma. And I think it was in like adolescents and children. So, showing in different populations the effects that stuff has, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I think whatever you can do to creatively unlock like the nuances of weight stigma would be really amazing. I hope that answers your question. Grant writing is like a little bit beyond me. I've never actually had to do that. So I don't know how, you get funding for something like that doesn't perpetuate the problem in the grant. And I think to some extent, maybe that's okay. Like maybe you just have to hold your nose and do that because only a few people are ever going to read the grant anyway. And then in the actual paper you can be much more radical, or as radical as possible with the inevitable peer review process that's going to come down the line too.
So that's our show. Thanks again so much to Heather Caplan for moderating this event and to the staff at East City Bookshop for hosting us what feels like a million years ago and what was in fact only almost 2 years ago. And thanks to you for listening. If you've gotten something out of this podcast, please help us reach more people who need to hear the anti-diet message, because who doesn't, especially this time of year, by sharing this episode and subscribing to the pod on Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcast platform. You can see all the places to subscribe at christyharrison.com/subscribe. That's christyharrison.com/subscribe. You can also leave us a nice rating and review in your podcast provider of choice, which is another way to help new listeners discover us and is always so appreciated. If you're looking for some practical guidance to help you get started on the anti-diet path, you can grab my free audio guide, 7 Simple Strategies for Finding Peace and Freedom with Food. Just go to christyharrison.com/strategies to get it. That's christyharrison.com/strategies. To get full show notes from this episode, including all the resources we discussed, plus a full transcript, just go to christyharrison.com/foodpsych. That's christyharrison.com/FOODPSYCH, the name of this podcast. This episode was brought to you by my book, Anti-Diet, Reclaim Your Time, Money, Well-Being, and Happiness Through Intuitive Eating, which is out in paperback in North America this week. You can also get it as a hardcover, audiobook, and ebook, wherever you get your books. Just go to christyharrison.com/book to order it now. That's christyharrison.com/book. A big thanks, as always, to our editor and sound engineer, Mike Lalonde, our community and content associate, Vinci Chue, our administrative assistant, Julianne Watasik, and our transcriptionist, Mycroft Holmes, for helping me out with all the moving parts that go into producing this show. Our album art was photographed by Abby Moore Photography and designed by Melissa Alam. Our theme song was written and performed by Carolyn Pennypacker Riggs. And I'm your host and producer, Christy Harrison. Thanks again for listening, and until next time, stay psyched.